Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming along to the latest Political Voices. I'm Mark Shanahan, I coordinate this programme for the Politics and IR department. I'm not going to say very much at all. We are not expecting any fire alarms, but if a fire alarm does go off, please can you go out and through the doors there. We'll be cruising at a height of 4'6". There will be no lighting on the floor to guide you to your exit, but we're not expecting anything to go wrong. In fact, I'm sure it will all go very right tonight. I'm going to hand over to Sir David to introduce our guest for tonight. The format that we'll run to is Sir David is going to do an introduction, then Alastair will do his Peter Campbell Memorial Lecture, and following that we'll have a Q&A which is open to whatever subjects you wish to raise. We are going to be filming live. This will go out on Facebook Live, so remember, if you do ask a question, your mother is watching. After we finish the Q&As, Alastair is going to stay behind afterwards and we'll be signing copies of his books outside in the lobby from here, and I'm sure we'll post the selfies and whatever else is planned. And we should all be finished shortly after 8 o'clock or so. So thank you very much. Sit back, relax, strap yourself in, phones off, phasers to stun, and over to Sir David.
Thank you very much, Mark, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you appreciate Mark is doing a brilliant job in bringing such a galaxy of stars to speak at the University of Reading. So thank you again, Mark, for all that you're doing to enable these great conversations to take place. As Mark said, tonight's lecture is in memory of Professor Peter Campbell. Peter was the founding head of the Department of Politics and International Relations here at the university and passed away in 2005. He was also the founder of the Conservative Group for Homosexual Equality and a vice president of the Electoral Reform Society. So I'm delighted to welcome Alastair Campbell to deliver this year's annual Peter Campbell Memorial Lecture. As many of you, most of you will know, Alastair was one of the key architects of New Labour and supported both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown over a decade-long political career. Actually, a career that went much before and continues today. He is, of course, as many of you will know, still very active in political campaigning and splits his time between consulting, writing, public speaking and charity work. Editor-at-large of the New European and chief interviewer of GQ magazine. Alastair also now works as an ambassador for Time to Change, campaigning to end the stigma of mental illness. Alastair, of course, needs no introduction, also as perhaps one of the most famous supporters of Burnley Football Club and a wonderful player of the bagpipes. And the theme around Time to Change and so on is one that's close to our hearts as a university. We know that mental health difficulties amongst young people are extremely common. And we also know here at the university we are trying to play our part in tackling some of these issues. Our psychology department in particular, with leading scientists working on many aspects of mental health, including depression and anxiety. We have here the Anxiety and Depression in Young People, the ANDI research unit, which works in collaboration with the Berkshire Healthcare NHS. We've also a number of many other ways in which we are able to support work to understand more about mental health. And coming back to Alastair, the cause of mental health is one that he has spoken very movingly and powerfully about, and we are looking forward to hearing what he has to say. And indeed, earlier this month, Alastair was made an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, whose outgoing chairman, Sir Simon Westley, described him as the best ambassador we have. Please welcome Alastair Campbell.
Thank you. Thank you. I couldn't help noticing coming in that this is room 101. So I'm going to tell you, if I was in the TV room 101, I would be taking with me ketchup. Hands up who shares my hatred of ketchup. Yes, it's more common than you think, I was telling you. Needles. Can't have needles and Brexit. Yeah. Keep fighting. Now, mental health. We're going to talk about mental health. I talk a lot about mental health, mainly from the perspective of the need to change the way we think about it, to eradicate discrimination, to end the inequality of access that exists, which means that only 15% of those who would benefit from talking therapy get it, to deliver on the maximum waiting times which exist in theory, but which frankly are not being met, to end disincentives in the system, which mean mental health is the service most likely to be cut when cuts are being called for, to make the words in the National Health Service Constitution promising parity between physical and mental health actually mean something, to stop people being shunted around the country for treatment, to stop mentally ill kids being locked up in police cells, to accept that the prisons are filled with people who should be in hospital, not jail, and to ask ourselves why mental illness is something of a research desert compared with physical illness. So there's enough to be going on with in the Time to Change campaign, of which, as David said, I'm an ambassador. I talk as well about this issue from a more personal perspective, my own issues of depression, drink, psychosis, suicide on both sides of my family, and above all the inspiration of a brother, Donald, who died last year, aged 62. Bang on cue, given that my father died aged 82, because a lifetime of antipsychotics takes around 20 years off your life. Now imagine if drugs for diabetes or asthma did that, it wouldn't be tolerated. But for people with schizophrenia, like my brother, these drugs are the necessary but cruel, harsh reality. So that fight goes on. But today, I want to come at this from a slightly different angle. Not just to speak up for the mentally ill as people who need support, but to speak up for the mentally ill as often major contributors to our life and times, to our history. I want to celebrate abnormality and thus specialness. Now in the campaign world on mental health, we use the figure 1 in 4. We say that 1 in 4 of us will have some kind of mental illness at some point in our life, and that has been a useful tactical tool. But actually, if we're talking about mental health, it's 1 in 1. We all have it. We're all on a spectrum of good days and bad. Hands up anybody here who has never had to see a doctor for a physical illness. Hands up anyone who's never needed to visit a hospital. So physical illness is accepted as universal. And yet, though the mind is more complex than the body, we wander around through our lives assuming we're all perfectly strong mentally, all of the time, never at risk of illness, never in need of help. It is, dare I say, collective madness to imagine this is so. You mentioned the Royal College of Psychiatrists. Last year, I was pleased to present their Lifetime Achievement Award to Professor Peter Tyra, who specialises in the treatment of personality disorders. And in his acceptance speech, he said, you know, we all have a bit of personality disorder. I am certainly among the 1 in 4. I am a depressive, albeit, to give you the title of one of my 13 books, because writing is part of my therapy, a happy depressive. I'm also among the number who's been hospitalised for mental illness back in the 80s after a psychotic breakdown, which was the worst period of my life in many ways, but which I now look back on as the best thing that ever happened to me. It was the worst because it was scary. It's scary when the mind cracks into thousands of pieces, so that I was hearing voices, hearing music. I convinced myself I was being tested by an unknown power. I was failing the test, and in my mind the punishment for this failure was death. Now you can see I'm still alive, I was clearly wrong. But that fear was real. It was intense. It was making me behave even more oddly than usual. So I was arrested for my own safety, I was locked up, I was released on condition I went to hospital, where a few days later a friendly psychiatrist named Dr. Ernest Benny, to whom I dedicated my first novel, which is about a psychiatrist who goes crazy, slowly led me to the realisation that I have depressive tendencies which I had for years been drowning in alcohol. So why do I now say that it was the best thing that happened to me? Because I learnt from it. I stopped drinking, didn't touch it for 13 years, and when I fell off the wagon, got back on reasonably quickly. I learnt also who and what were important. I sorted myself out. I got my career back on track. My partner, Fiona, stuck by me when many wouldn't, and a year later, the first of our children was born. So life was good. Then, having done what I thought was the hard bit, the depressions kept coming. They still do. But I'm stronger. I'm more resilient. I've learnt coping strategies which include medication, music, sport, diet, Burnley Football Club and my obsessive support for them, and little psychological tricks that are known only to me and sometimes, when they're his idea, to my shrink. And I'm pleased if my openness, as people tell me it does, helps others. But I should also say it helps me too. I've also been very, very lucky. Much of the discrimination in mental health comes in the workplace, where bosses have an incredibly important role to play in breaking down the stigma and the taboo. So here's the luck that I had. My former boss, a guy called Richard Stott, had been very, very angry when I left the Mirror to join a rival newspaper. But when I was ill in hospital, he was one of the first people to call me, and the conversation went like this. Richard, I hear you've gone mad. Well, I'm not well. Well, says Richard, I won't say I told you so, which is a subtle, not subtle way of saying I told you so, but here's what you should do. Stay in hospital for as long as you need to be there. Take the money from Today, the other newspaper, for as long as you want, and as soon as you're fit, come back here and start again. That was an act of friendship I will never forget. It showed at a time I thought my career was over, aged 28, that a former boss was not going to define me through one period of mental illness. I would later become his political editor and would be with him right up to the point when Tony Blair asked me to join his team, which I did with Richard's support. Richard, alas now dead, would later also edit my diaries. Tony, he was understanding as an employer as well. When he asked me to work for him, I felt I owed it to him to talk him through the many things in my past that might, just might, become a political or media problem. The drink, I'd written pornography, I'd had occasional troubles with what you might call football violence. This is what I call the conversation that David Cameron never had with Andy Coulson. And when I told Tony the music and the voices in my head mid-breakdown, he did look, I'll confess, a little bit worried. But eventually he said, well, I'm not bothered if you're not bothered. And I said, well, what if I'm bothered? He said, I'm still not bothered. But one thing I do know, if it hadn't been for my breakdown, I don't think I would have been able to do the job I did for as long as I did, with the energy and commitment that I gave it, nor to take on all the things that I take on now. And why do I say that? Because I have a yardstick for pressure. I still get depressive episodes. I still get anxious and stressed. But I find a quiet space and I say to myself, if the breakdown was 9 out of 10 bad, how bad is this? And it rarely rises above 4 or 5. It's also taught me something that I now see as the single most important quality any of us can develop when engaged in difficult challenges, and that is resilience. Politics is impossible without it. It's not nice when newspapers repeatedly call you a liar or compare you with Hitler, Goebbels or Rasputin. I've had all of those. It's not easy being the centre of firestorm upon firestorm, but you know what? It's not nearly as bad as standing in the foyer of a council building in Hamilton in Scotland with your head exploding, thinking you're about to be taken away and killed. I was lucky with that moment as well. It was the end of a very long day that had started after a very long night, which had ended with me having a row on the phone with Fiona because I was late again and drunk again. So rather than go home, I checked into a hotel, got to my room and I emptied the minibar. I had to fly to Scotland the next morning, pick up a hire car, which I ended up dumping when I realised after going round and round and round about dozens and dozens of times that I was unfit to drive. A few hours later, as the voices are now crowding in on me in the foyer of a public building, I feel the need to phone home. I'm shown to a phone in an office, this is pre-mobiles, and I call Fiona, no reply. I call my parents, no reply. I call my brothers, no reply. My sister, no reply. Call the office, no reply. I call the number of any friend or relative whose number I can remember, no reply to any of them. Later I learn it was a weekend. Every time I was pressing 0, I was going through to an unmanned switchboard. I go back to the foyer, feeling more and more isolated. I empty my pockets. Don't know why. I empty my bag on the floor. Don't know why. I talk to anyone who passes, convinced that they're talking to or about me. Then 2 men approach, both my height, which is quite unusual. "You okay?" says one. "Do you know what?" I said. "I don't think I am." "Do you think you should come with us?" says the other. But they could have been the Moonies. But I said yes. And later I realised this was the first time I'd admitted I wasn't well. I then discover they're police officers, plainclothes police officers. Next thing I know, I'm in the back of a police car. The next thing I know, I'm in a cell. The next thing I know, I'm taking off all my clothes and trying to wreck the place. But here's the luck, and I still have dreams/nightmares about this. Imagine if I had reacted not with acquiescence, but with violence. Could easily have happened. Today, more than ever, the police are the front line of mental health. Now, I'm not recommending psychotic breakdowns for all, but I am saying that sometimes it's too simplistic to think of mental illness only in terms of the suffering and the pain, because mine, in my view, has made me whatever it is that I am. I'm proud to talk about it because I'm proud that I learnt from it and use it to this day. Get good out of bad is one of the rules of my life. I wrote a book called Winners and How They Succeed, and in it one of my favourite quotes is from an Irishman called Colm O'Connell, who coaches Kenyan middle distance and long distance athletes. And he says, "The winner is the loser who evaluates defeat properly." A big part of winning, a big part of success in any operation you're engaged in is about the mind. Mental strength, determination, the ability to respond in the right way to failure, the ability to handle pressure, the ability to get good from bad. When Michael Jordan was inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame, in his acceptance speech, he thanked players who'd been picked ahead of him, coaches who hadn't selected him, journalists who'd criticised him for fueling the fire of his ambition. And if anything sums up why Jordan is among the greatest winning mindsets ever, it was his comment that limits, like fears, are often just an illusion. That is an extreme mindset. It is an abnormal way of thinking. Yet abnormality of thinking is too often what leads people to say of others, "He's mad, she's bonkers, what a nutter, thinks he can fly to the moon." And guess what? Somebody flies to the moon. I remember when Bono and Bob Geldof were once lobbying Tony Blair before a summit in Germany. And Tony was warning them he couldn't deliver all that they were asking for regarding the writing off of third world debt. Bob Geldof went into one of his customary effing and blinding rages, which are spectacular to behold. Tony tried to calm him by saying we would get there in the end because of all the different agendas of the different G8 countries. It felt like we were looking at the moment at Everest, to which Bono replied, "Tony, when you see Everest, you don't look at it, you fucking climb it." Clive Woodward is the only English coach to have won the Rugby World Cup. Ask him to name his single most important quality. He says, "I'm an obsessive. I pride myself on it. It's a good trait. It's not something you should be worried about. Obsession is not about sending emails after midnight to prove how hard you're working. Obsession is obsession for the detail of the what, the how and the why you've got to do all the things you need to do to win." Now, it can go too far. I left Downing Street in 2003, and one of the first things I did, partly as kind of therapy, as an excuse to travel the world talking to people I admired, I did a series on great sportsmen and women for the Times. That was when I first met the cyclist Lance Armstrong. I freely confess I totally fell for the legend. I believed his protestations that he was the most drugs-tested athlete on the planet, he'd never tested positive, and it was time the critics let go. And I loved his mindset, summed up in what was without doubt the best single quote of the whole series. He said this: "When I was sick with cancer, I didn't want to die. When I race, I don't want to lose. Dying and losing, it's the same thing." Now, knowing what we know now, the logic is obvious, and the former journalist in me should have been alert to it. If you equate losing a race on a bike with losing your life, then just as most people would do anything to stay alive, so in his case, he would do anything to win, including cheating. Today, I can only cringe when I read this other quote, that my cancer caused me to be a brutally open and honest person. His is a story of what can happen when the desire to win goes beyond legal and moral limits. But just because obsessiveness can become destructive doesn't mean that anybody with what one could term an extreme mind should be regarded automatically with suspicion. In fact, I think the opposite is often true. One of the most telling things I've heard about the mindset of winners is a remark made to me by Billy Bean, who is the man who transformed Oakland A's baseball team with data-driven analysis and became famed throughout sport and beyond as the star of Moneyball, the book, and then the film. "The reason all really successful people have to be slightly mad," he said, "is because people like that are not capable of living in the comfort zone. It is a state of mind that makes sure you never rest on laurels. Always focus on the next thing. Never ever let yourself slide into that comfort zone." Now, mad is not a term that should readily be bandied about, but he's onto something. The fact is that people who want to succeed, to push things that bit further, tend to have characteristics that place them beyond what is generally defined as normal. To me, the most dreaded place on earth is the comfort zone. My least favourite word, Fiona revealed this in an interview recently, my least favourite word is content. Now, my mother was a very content person. There's nothing wrong with it. It's all she ever wanted, to be happy in her life, to care for her family and for others. And she'd often say to me, "Why do you put yourself under so much pressure?" And the answer is, and I can see her now shaking her head as I reply, that pressure can create physical, emotional and psychological change which can focus and sharpen the mind, give greater energy to the body and improve performance at whatever it is that you're trying to do. And the dangers of avoiding pressure, in my view, are complacency, stagnation. Garry Kasparov, the world's greatest chess player, came crashing down when he lost his world title in London in 2000. And he said this to me: "I was at a very high peak. I felt invincible. Not only did this make me complacent, it also meant I'd ceased to grow in areas that I did not require to win. I was crushing the competition. So why should I worry? That is why," he said, "you must always challenge yourself with doing new things, leaving your comfort zone. So it's a delicate balancing act. Pressure good, stress bad, balance sometimes difficult. When King Lear was on at the National Theatre a couple of years ago, I did a talk there on power and madness. I don't know why they asked me. I was there with a guy called Nasser Gamey, who is the professor of psychiatry at Tufts Medical Center in Boston. Fascinating guy. He says that normal people are naturally conformist. They go through education, through career paths in which the goal is often to be liked and to achieve according to the norms of a previous generation. Parents who want to keep them safe and secure. Teachers who want to get them through exams. And he believes that this normality obsession discourages the development of skills actually needed to win. Great achievement, therefore, requires something beyond normal. Now, the most abnormal period of my life probably was the build-up to and the event of my breakdown, and I do think it prepared me for the abnormality of a life in the political and government front line. It didn't change who I was, but it changed the way I thought about it and applied that to living. The fact that the mental torture of depression allows you to appreciate good times more, that the mania that sometimes comes before and after a depressive episode can produce great bursts of activity and creativity. Like I said, I'm not recommending it. Psychosis, never good, okay? Nor do I will the horror of depression upon any of you. But I am saying that characteristics we associate with mental health problems might also be the engines that help us to overcome, to succeed, and to win. Innovation and creativity, this is Professor Gamey speaking now, are explicitly a reflection of mania. There are four main features of mania. Increased rapid thought. Well, how often have we wanted increased rapid thought? Increased physical and mental activity. What's wrong with that? Increased, this is a dangerous one, increased likelihood of taking risk. Increased confidence and self-esteem. Sometimes that's good, sometimes less so. When taken to excess, as I know, those characteristics can be dangerous. They can be deadly. But there can be enormous advantages in them when the mania is more or less under control. My best friend who died a few years ago, Philip Gould, he pointed out in his book, I did some of my best work when going through a manic phase, and other parts of my best work when I was in the throes of what he used to call the glums. I wrote the first draft of my third novel about a teenage alcoholic girl in 9 days. One of them was Christmas Day. I couldn't stop once the creative dam broke. That was mild mania making me more creative than usual. By definition, rapid thought and increased physical and mental activity make you work harder, get more done. So provided the work is good and the decisions being made are the right ones, that should in theory be a good thing. And of course, no innovation happens without a degree of jeopardy. Another sports guy, Dave Brailsford, cycling genius, I asked him for the book on winning, what walk of life have you learned the most from outside cycling? And he said straight out, psychiatry, no doubt about it. He hired this guy, Steve Peters, who at the time was dealing with psychopathic personalities at Rampton High Security Psychiatric Hospital. He said, I realised that a lot of the things he knew applied to our riders. I'm not saying that they're all psychopaths, but what makes them special is that their minds don't work in the same way as most people's. They are extreme. Extreme ambition, extreme talent, extreme drive, extreme ego. There are risks. They can be strong, but they can be vulnerable. And Steve is brilliant at making the strong side stronger and the vulnerable side less vulnerable. Move from sport to politics. If we took a survey of who is the greatest historical figure of my lifetime, I'm sure that Donald Trump would say Donald Trump, but I, and I'm sure some of you, would say Nelson Mandela, whom I was lucky enough to meet on several occasions. For much of his life, he was labelled an extremist. It's not normal to be able to endure 27 years in jail and come out smiling and full of forgiveness. That is not normal. It's not normal to be able to cope with the torture of knowing for all that time you may never see your family, and you know that they're being abused and hounded. And who was the Mandela of my parents' and my grandparents' generation? Again, I think a lot of people would say Winston Churchill. Who was the American president that all American presidential candidates feel they have to laud as the greatest president ever? Abraham Lincoln. Both were depressives, in Churchill's case of the manic variety. Charles Darwin, Florence Nightingale, Marie Curie, all had what doctors today would define as some form of serious mental illness. Now imagine a world in which those five had never been able to fulfill their potential because their mental frailties had been viewed as overwhelming obstacles. This world would be a very different place. They were change makers, and their influence is with us today. Florence Nightingale single-handedly reinvented the basic concept of healthcare, as well as challenging the idea that women could not be medical professionals. She was bipolar. Gamey, my man in Boston, he believes there's a strong link between depression and realism, which can contribute to leadership skills required in times of challenge and difficulty. Now, this may in part be because depressives have experienced such lows that they can envisage the many different, often bad outcomes, and this ability perhaps leads them to lead well in a crisis, or to have better strategies for avoiding it. The thing about crisis, he says, is that the depressive imagines the worst and works to avoid it. The optimist believes they can handle the crisis and that everything is going to turn out fine. He talked about Chamberlain when pursuing a policy of appeasement, when Churchill was constantly warning him about the dangers of Hitler and the need for a stronger riposte. Indeed, Churchill's first public warning about the possible threat posed by German rearmament was in 1930, when Ramsay MacDonald was Prime Minister. Then in March 1934, he told Parliament, "Germany is arming fast, no one is going to stop her. I dread the day when the means of threatening the heart of the British Empire should pass into the hands of the present rulers of Germany. I dread that day, but it is not perhaps far distant." It was a steady message through several premierships. And were, I wonder, his depressive instincts making him more realistic about the threat, and Chamberlain's natural optimism blinding him to possible danger? Gamey, for one, believes so. He says the same, I regret to inform you, about Tony Blair and George Bush in relation to Iraq, but we'll perhaps cover that in Q&A. Depressives, though some may take their own lives and do, tend to be more resilient as well. I love this quote. This was written by Abraham Lincoln's law partner, William Herndon. He said, "Melancholy dripped from him with every step that he took. But he had an inner strength, as tough and gnarled as seasoned hickory wood, and the increasing hostility that his policies provoked as the country drifted into war bounced off him like peas from a pea shooter against a wall." That is resilience through depression. Martin Luther King. How many people, when they're asked what's the greatest speech ever made, will say, "I have a dream," even though none of us know what came after "I have a dream." Martin Luther King was a great leader, and I would argue, not despite being manic depressive, but because of it. The mania gave him energy, high self-esteem, which contributed to his charisma, important in any campaign leader, and made him forward-thinking, which is important in strategy. His depressive side often outweighed the manic side, and he had the qualities associated with depression, particularly the understanding of human emotional pain, and that allowed him to be an exceptional, empathetic team leader. And it's not unusual for anxiety to go hand in hand with creativity. Charles Darwin, this is my favourite date fact. Charles Darwin was born on exactly the same day as Abraham Lincoln, February the 12th, 1809. He had chronic panic attacks that often left him in floods of tears. In stressful situations, he would have palpitations, skin inflammation, agoraphobia, blinding headaches, agonising stomach cramps. He consulted more than 20 quack doctors in a vain bid to find a cure. But alongside the illness, this restless intellect that couldn't accept any status quo and was constantly asking, what if, what if, what if? Now, the reason I think it's important to understand all this is that a lot of the stigma around mental illness is still attached to this anything that smacks of abnormal activity is somehow always wrong. And I think that actually means organisations are missing out on having more potential achievers and winners in their midst. Sport is leading the way, business and politics are catching up. Part of the work I do with Time to Change is a thing we do called Dime to Change. We go out with these business leaders, and one of the things I try to persuade them is that if they're recruiting and they've got two identical CVs, same O-levels, same A-levels, both did the gap year, intern at this, charity at this, did all this stuff, and then this one over here, 6 months has gone missing. Don't quite know what happened. If that 6 months was because they were in rehab, because they had a breakdown, because they were self-harming and needed treatment for it, and I would say if they put that down on their CV, I'm going to give the job to that one over that one, if that's the only thing separating them. Because one, you've got honesty, and two, you're more likely to have resilience. And here's the weird thing about sport and politics. The demands in sport are predominantly physical. And yet it's now seen as routine for top athletes to have proper psychological and psychiatric support. In politics and business, by contrast, where the challenges are much more mental than physical, no such attitude change has taken place. And it's a huge mistake, born of the fact that people all too easily feel threatened by those who are different. And it's still considered in political and business circles, in many of them, to be an admission of weakness ever to suggest that you yourself are suffering from some kind of mental strain. Excuse me. Yet the stress under which political and business leaders work, the hours, the volume and nature of issues they're having to deal with, the shocks and setbacks that come with the turf, the time spent separated from family, all likely to have negative psychological impact. Far better, surely, to acknowledge that, to work with it, but most leaders just plough on. It's really odd that 90 to 95% of athletes have proper psychological support, but politicians who are operating under massive pressure think they can do without it. I'm going to leave the last word on this to somebody who knows sport, politics and business from the inside, and that's Sebastian Coe. At the Moscow Olympics, Coe was meant to win his first race and didn't. He wasn't meant to win his second race. Between the first and the second race, he's having a session with a sports psychologist. And the sports psychologist is saying the best way to approach this second race is to try to create a normal environment as Seb prepares to go for gold again. And Seb, anybody who knows him, is normally very mild-mannered, but he was having none of it. And it touched a chord in him. And he said, "Are you calling me normal? Do you think what I do is normal? Do you think running 3 times a day, 100 miles a week is normal? I don't. Don't ever tell me I'm normal. I'm not normal. There's not a single person in this team who's normal. We are all fucking mad." A few days later, he won gold, the goal that nobody expected him to win. So, fight Brexit, because it's affecting my mental health very badly, and it's going to affect the nation's mental health badly long into the future. Fight for better understanding, better awareness, better services. Be open. I know the risks, but I think you'll be better and we'll all be better if we feel that we can be open about whatever mental frailties we may have. And one day we will look back and we will say, do you know what? There used to be a time in Britain where you had these drugs that you took for mental illnesses and you took 20 years off your life and nobody thought it mattered. Do you know what? It used to be that if you admitted that you had an issue of addiction, or you had an issue of psychosis or depression, or whatever it might be, and you're on medication, that actually a lot of employers will just put your application form in the bin. That has got to go. It will go, it can go, but only if we understand it is a campaign. It's one I hope that you have felt enough of what I say to want to get involved in, to support Time to Change and work together to try and get genuine parity between physical and mental health, because until we get that, we are not a truly civilised country. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you to Alastair Campbell for delivering the Peter Campbell lecture. I do like the idea of having a Campbell delivering the Campbell lecture.
He was a Troy though.
A certain kind of one. So I'm thinking next year we may go Naomi, by the way.
Sol.
You will see around here there are some people with microphones. If you would like to ask a question, and we do have around about half an hour for questions, please put your hand up. And one of the people with
Not you
microphones.
again. Got a Russian stalker down here.
So one of the people with microphones will come and find Maria, and anyone else who wants to ask a question. Academics are known for asking very long questions. I said this on Thursday night when Jess Phillips was here and came to a person in the front row who asked a 7-point question.
Oh my God.
So can you keep them brief and not expect to have a lot of follow-ups? If it's a good question, you will get a follow-up, please. Any subjects? Happy to take?
Yeah.
The challenge is yours, people. If you do have a question, please do put your hand up. And we're starting with Maria here.
Thanks. Thank you for your great speech. It was really perfect, actually. So I want to ask you a question about the system of mental health care. Because if we look through the internet, there are a lot of criticism of it. So there are a lot of
In the UK?
In the UK, actually. So do you think that it is in crisis, actually, or it's some problems with media and communications of NHS, for example? So.
I think it's very, very patchy. I think there are parts of the National Health Service, mental health service, that are brilliant, that are second to none. My brother, as I say, died last year. When he died, when my sister and I sat down, we had a map of the UK, and we would draw all these places where he'd been in different hospitals in his last 40 years during his, struggles with schizophrenia, where he was having crises. And I would say 80% of the healthcare was good that he got. I do hear from other places that have horror stories. And one of the real worries I've got is that actually as we win the campaign to break down the stigma and the taboo, that makes more people feel they can and should be open about mental health issues, and they go and find the services aren't there. I mean, I live in Northwest 3 in London. We have the highest proportion of psychiatrists per head, I think, anywhere in the world. Almost all of them private. I think for child and adolescent mental health services are going backwards very, very badly. Other parts of the system are good. And like I say, we've had two successes. Cameron said mental health was a priority. Theresa May, when she became Prime Minister, said mental health is a priority. But priority means you deliver. You change policy. A priority, you can only have priority means it's more important than everything else. And the tragedy, the reality of Brexit is that's the only priority they've got. So I do worry that we're going backwards. Yeah.
One of the issues we do face is
Academic.
Can't resist it. A question from one of my graduates from last year who's tweeted it in and has asked, what about servicemen who've returned from Iraq, Afghanistan with PTSD? It seems to be a problem that has emerged more and more. Are we doing enough? And taking it back politically, was it something that even came into the equation when forces were sent overseas following 2001 and 9/11?
Yeah. I do think there's this relates to what I was saying earlier about openness. I think there's a greater acceptance of. I said to you earlier, I do some work with the military, and the military, I think, is doing a much better job at taking care of the mental well-being of their troops before and after. They understand how important it is. Are the services there? No, they're not. When you go around, I don't know if it's the same in Reading, I'm sure it is, but certainly parts of London now, you don't have to go very far before you see a serviceman on the streets. And they will have some form of mental illness, almost for sure. Often it will be alcoholism, but often it will be some form of PTSD. I was in Canada, I'm actually making a documentary about mental illness at the moment. I was in Canada talking about PTSD the other day to this guy, and I didn't realise that the only medication that they're giving for PTSD is actually the one that I'm on for depression, which says to me that's, you know, the research that goes into this is so, that's another one where it's the Cinderella service. So I think I remember when I was growing up, I used to stay every summer at my uncle's farm, and there was a guy there who used to come round. He was the old marketing board guy who came to test the milk all the time. He came around every few weeks. And he was I remember my aunt always used to say, he's a lovely guy, but he's got a real problem with his nerves. You know, and that was what we used to say, he's got a real problem with his nerves. And actually, I got to know the guy a bit. Today we'd say he was an ex-serviceman with PTSD. So at least it's defined now, at least it's out in the open. So that side has got better. But I think in terms of the consequences of what these guys, often very, very young, are put through, I don't think we are nearly across it as we should be.
Questions? Leg in the middle there.
I know that you were Tony Blair's spin doctor when he had altercations a lot with Mugabe. I come from Zimbabwe, and I think it's very important to ask this question. You talked about being people who do extreme things that are not normal. And one of the things that has come up to my mind since for the time I did my MA in politics here on Democrats is the abnormality of Mugabe and looking at it at the moment, at the place where we are. Do you think it falls under that?
I would not have put him in my list of abnormalities to celebrate, no. Look, I think there are... I watched that extraordinary statement last night, and it was mind-blowing. I met Mugabe a couple of times, and in fact I was asked the other night who are the most, of all the people you've ever met, this is before this current situation, who are the most evil you've ever met, and I put him right up there, I think. And you felt it in his presence, you felt it. You felt it with the entourage that he had, you felt it with the... he was obsessed with this idea that all Tony Blair's advisors were gay. He used to say to all, you're all just gay, look at you, you're all gay. Very odd. So no, I would not. And as to what happens now, I mean, I think, look, he's not going to survive. I think last night was the death throes of his leadership. But it does show you, I mean, the fact that he could have survived as long as he did, and it's not just about him and the people around him. I remember we used to argue with Mbeki in South Africa, and it's very hard. They slightly bought the line from Mugabe, that the British criticism of Mugabe was a kind of, you know, a throwback to our colonial past, and we didn't really understand. And so he survived a lot longer than he should have done, in part because of the influence that he was able to bring to bear on his neighbours as well. But, you know, there's the history of leadership. There are good leaders and the bad leaders, but the bad leaders, when they're really bad, they can get away with an awful lot. And he did.
Who's good at the moment in terms of global politics? Who would you look to? Who would you assess?
Well, it's the global scene. I mean, right, I'm going to do a little something here, right? Hands up. I do this with every audience I do. Apart from the last one, because you were asking all the questions. Hands up who is optimistic or pessimistic about Trump being president? Hands up with optimistic. 1, 2. Hands up pessimistic. Hands up who's optimistic about Brexit. 12. Hands up who's... You? Fiona? I don't believe that. Isn't it funny? I thought she was really intelligent. Hands up who's pessimistic about Brexit. Hands up who thinks Theresa May will be Prime Minister at the next election. She'll stand at the next election. Hands up who thinks Jeremy Corbyn will be Prime Minister after the next election. Now that is a crisis in global and British leadership. You have zero respect for the American president. You have massive opposition and anxiety about Brexit. You have no faith in the current Prime Minister. And even though he seems to have been on a non-stop victory parade since losing the election, you have very few people who actually think Jeremy Corbyn is going to be Prime Minister. So it's bad. It's bad. So who do I rate? I mean, look, she's struggling today, but I think Merkel is an extraordinary leader in many ways. I think she'll probably get through this, but it's going to be difficult. I worked with the Macron campaign, and I think he has got extraordinary talent, but it's too young, it's too early to see. I think Trudeau is very interesting and very seems to me to have a lot of what it takes, but again, it's probably too early to tell. But I was saying when I was talking to you about politics students, leadership is about defining the great challenges of our time, and the great anxieties of our time, and meeting them. And I don't see any leader doing that. Putin is getting away with murder, literally. These Russians don't like me for saying that. We'll probably report it straight back, won't you? Have to watch out for the umbrellas on the tray. But no, you know, it's Putin is extraordinary because Russia is not a powerful economy really, but he's the only one. When I wrote the book about winners, I've got this thing about you have to be clear about your objective, then work out the strategy, and only then go tactical. Objective, strategy, tactics. That's what you've got to do. And the thing about Putin is his objective, strategy, and tactics is the only person in the world I can think of this. They're totally aligned. Objective, reassertion of Russian power. Strategy, the reassertion of Russian power. Tactics, anything which reasserts Russian power. And even if he doesn't do it, so you've got all this talk now about were the Russians funding the Leave campaign? Was there all these Twitter bots and all that stuff? Was that all about sort of getting to Brexit, getting to Trump, getting to the German election? It probably was, but even if it wasn't, that's a form of hybrid influence that people think that he's got that sort of influence. So, and he's done that in part by doing things that we can't do and wouldn't want to do. You know, shutting down newspapers, throwing editors in jail, taking out opponents, not allowing the opposition really to exist, all this stuff. And don't tell me Navalny's being allowed to exist in a proper opposition kind of way. So, and you've got these two forms of leadership now. So, you know, Putin, I was in South Africa recently and they said, you know what our really big fear is at the moment? The Putinization of our politics. That's just a noun, the Putinization of our politics. Erdogan. It's the Putinization of politics. And that's what's under threat in Europe. And so somebody was asking me over with the students, you know, is democracy kind of failing and has it had its day? And well, hopefully not, but I think we have to grow up a bit and accept that the non-democracies are operating at massive advantage.
One of the keys to effective democracy is having an effective media. In these Murdoch, Dacre, Barclay Brothers worlds that we're in at the moment, even the BBC, how healthy is our media?
It's not. It's very, very unhealthy. And throw in, I mean, I've got to be honest, when the social media revolution started, I thought, oh, this is great, this is going to be the way to, you know, bring these guys down. But I'm not sure it's really worked out like that. I think you've got a different form of, you've got new media oligarchs, but their output is actually driven as much by the old media. You know, when you're sort of looking through your Facebook page and your Twitter stuff and all the rest of it, so much of it is coming from what we would it gets defined as mainstream media, but they're now sort of melding in the same place. I was saying to the students, I'm very jury out on Zuckerberg, I tweet obsessively, but that's just because I'm mad about Brexit and I tweet all the time. But I'm not persuaded really that it's changing the democratic debate for the better. And we have to take some responsibility for this because it's one of the things. If you get my diaries, Tony and I argued about this the whole time. We did play the media, we did try and get Murdoch on side, we did try and neutralise the Mail, we did try and get a better hearing. Once we were in power, I kept wanting to. Now this is an issue. I talk about leadership being about identifying real issues and real challenges. We knew that the culture was an issue. Tony would rail about it the whole time, but then doing it with all the other priorities you had, we just never did it. And maybe he was right. Maybe you can't do it and function as a government. But then if that's the case, you don't have a healthy democracy.
Back to the floor. Dominic, up in the middle.
Speak.
Okay. You mentioned the crisis in leadership in the UK or across Europe. You mentioned your work with the Macron campaign. How likely do you think it is that in light of the structural constraints of the third party or independent candidate emerging, the political crisis within the UK will lead to a similar outcome?
I think it's difficult to. I find it hard to see how that is going to happen in the UK because the French system is so different. It's a presidential system. They elect the president and then they elect the parliament. Our leader has to come through parliament. And I just don't know. Look, I hear a lot of talk about it. I was asked at the students' event, and I get asked on the train coming down, people say, when are we going to have a new party? Sure, we need a new party. But it's like everybody's willing other people to do the things. It's like if I had a power, everybody said, why doesn't David Miliband come back and lead the Labour Party? Well, one, does he want to come back? Two, would he get elected? Would he get a seat? Would he get chosen by the party? Probably not, because Corbyn's in charge. So why doesn't he start a new party? Well, he's Labour. So it's really, really difficult. And I think if a new party started, I'm sure there's lots of people thinking that would be a good thing, and I'm sure there's lots of people who would fund it. But what would it stand for? It can't just be anti-Brexit. Could be, I guess. But I think the most depressing thing I found about the last election was two competing visions of the past. It was, you want to go back to the 50s with the Tories or the 70s with Labour. There was nothing about, robotics, artificial intelligence, where are the jobs of the future coming. So I found the last election depressing, but I just think a new party, it's one of those things that sounds like it ought to be easy. But you just remember the SDP. That was at a time of massive left-right division, Labour moving to the left, Tories moving to the right, Europe hanging over the whole thing. So lots of similarities. But the SDP was founded by 4 parliamentary giants compared to what we've got today. And yet they failed. So I guess, I don't know. I'm feeling, I don't know where it's going to go. Something has to give though. This is unsustainable. You can't have a situation where in a room like this with intelligent, educated people, there is zero respect for the American president, massive anxiety about the biggest challenge the government's faced, and May and Corbyn, neither of them seen as Prime Minister. Is it possible? It's unsustainable.
Well, we've supposedly gone beyond the age of experts. Nobody seems to be listening.
I think people are listening, but I think I was talking. By the way, we've got to stop calling Farage. It's Farage. Okay? He hates it. Farage. That's his name. He's called Farage. That's what he's called at school. So, but arguing with him the other day, and it was oh yeah, well but 80% of people voted for a Brexit party in the last election. That's ridiculous. No, because Labour and both main parties said we're leaving. I voted Labour to stop Brexit because I voted Labour to stop Theresa May getting a mandate for a hard Brexit, and we did. We succeeded in that. Since when Jeremy Corbyn's barely mentioned Brexit. We'll give it a go.
Question from the chap in purple.
Hi. Given what we'll just for the sake of time call the political climate, were there any specific things that you would suggest that we as people without a media empire or a standing invitation to the daily politics can do to actually make an impact, other than just, you know, say to our friends on social media or whatever, like, you know, these are the issues that were important to us, or I'll vote, like, what else can we do?
I think you can do more than you could when I was your age, because the downside of social media is the kind of volume and the noise and the chaos and what have you, but the upside is that everybody does have a platform and everybody can organise, and there's no doubt in my mind that part of Corbyn's success is down to better use of social media, both within the Labour Party against people like me and against the Tories in the last election. The Leave campaign did this, you know, networking across campaigning much better than the Remain side. Trump did it better than Hillary, even though Hillary won the popular vote, never stopped saying that as well. But so I think you have to do what you can do. And that might be by joining a party, it might be by starting your own campaign on a particular thing that you care about, it might be by boring the pants off every single person that you ever meet to sort of sign them up to what you do. You do that one, yeah? Good man. But campaigning is a mindset. You have to care, and you have to want to care, and you have to want to make change. And then there's certain basics of campaigning that haven't changed. It is good to get other people writing about it. It is good to get in the media. It is good to organise events where people swap ideas about how to do the campaign. So you have to feel it and want to do it. It has to become part of your mindset. And the thing is that, you know, you look at some of the people who have emerged. I look at some of these. You know, to take just a small issue. Well, it's a big issue, but a small part of the political debate. The fixed odds betting terminals thing. That was a small campaign. That was a couple of people who decided we're going to do this. I do a lot of campaigning for alcohol concern. There's the Scottish Government that finally got through this thing about minimum pricing for alcohol. That's a campaign. They've made real change. You know, so don't think you can't do stuff. Here we are in this room now. I don't know when. If this was 20 years ago and I was doing this talk now, half of us are lit up by now. Nobody's smoking now because there was a campaign to stop that happening, and the change came. So find the things that you can do, and eventually some of you will then get taken into what you might call the party political space and change that. That's changing fast as well. I was saying, I mentioned Philip Gould there. He was my closest friend in politics. His daughter, who I've known since she was a baby, she tried to get a seat in Parliament a few years ago. Didn't work out. She became a councillor. She's now leading Camden Council. She's got she's overseeing mental health services, social services, housing. She's doing stuff. She's 31. So I think don't just think about it in the sort of traditional way. My daughter's 23 and she's campaigning, man. She's got certain issues that she's obsessed about free tampons for kids on school meals, free school meals. Campaigning on it. She's making films about it. She's just doing it. So just do stuff. And if you see Boris Johnson walking down the road, near him in the nuts.
Go to the chap in the grey shirt.
Make you feel a lot better.
Not actually a question, but there is Berkshire for Europe, here in which meets in Reading.
Yeah, buy the New European as well. Hands up who gets the New European. I'd be very angry if there are no hands up. 2, 3, okay. 4, good. Get the New European. It's the only paper telling the truth about what's happening in Britain. Thank you.
Abnormality and Brexit.
Yeah.
You mentioned, and you were enthusiastic about the abnormal, the people who are creative and different and inventive. Now, coming from the Libertarians, who are great many of them are anti-Brexiters, you think of the Dysons and the Bamfords and what have you, they would put themselves, I think, probably, I don't agree, in that category of entrepreneurs, people taking risks, and a lot of the argument is that you should be in an insecure situation. That's their argument. So how do you square that how do we square it, or how do you square it with the support for remaining or supporting the EU?
No, I think that I'm not pretending that all great people and all great minds and all great thinkers must conform to to my political views. I think that Dyson. I'll just say one thing about Dyson. I've never ever successfully dried my hands on one of his air blades, and so they've got different. Yeah, they would say that, and I think that's fair enough. They're innovators, they're inventors, and God, none of us want a world where everybody thinks the same and everybody is the same. And I was making a point less about Brexit. In fact, it wasn't really about Brexit at all. It was about trying to change the lens on how we look at mental illness from certain perspectives. I don't minimise at all, particularly for those people who are living all the time with a serious mental illness, which is affecting their physical health, it's affecting their ability to even to survive in some cases, financially. I don't minimise that at all, but I think sometimes there's a danger that we look at mental health and mental illness and it's just like, oh, poor you, poor them, poor me. Whereas actually, I think there is a positive to certainly to mental abnormality that I think we should be less sensitive about. So no, I don't deny that the Dysons of this world may have a certain intelligence and specialness. I just think their views are wrong, and also think it's absurd. Talk about the BBC. The way that Dyson gets treated when he gets interviewed at the BBC is absurd. The guy's got a vested interest. He shipped his company out to bloody Malaysia. He didn't like the European Union for certain bureaucratic rules that stopped him doing business, and he wants to pay people less.
I must say there are some very fine things about Malaysia, including a really good university campus.
I wasn't knocking Malaysia.
I'm going to stand up so that I can actually see some hands.
This
It's
guy
very
has been
blatant.
lacking a lot.
Right.
He's got a sore arm, yeah.
Thank you, Alastair. I just wanted to get your take on the expansion of Labour Party membership under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership.
Yeah.
We're at 600,000 members,
Yeah.
which is the most we've had since about 1997.
Yeah.
And I know there was a dip in membership. I think maybe we were about 200,000 during around 2005. What's your take on that swell in membership? And I mean, I'm a Labour Party member. I want to know, is there any optimism? Can we do anything with these activists that we've got joining the party?
Well, the answer should be yes. The answer should be yes, but I do think there's a... I wish Fiona was here because she's much more active in our local party than I am. But I think there's a divisiveness that both sides want to blame each other for. I keep, for example, every time I say anything, even vaguely critical, and I think there's a lot to criticise, by the way, I really do. I think that, I can't forgive his lack of campaigning in the Brexit referendum. I'm not saying he didn't do lots of events, but he didn't campaign. We saw in the last election, he knows how to campaign when he wants to. He didn't campaign on Brexit, I can't forgive that. I don't like his defence policy, I don't like a lot of the things he says on foreign policy. I don't like the fact he never calls out Putin. So there's lots of stuff I can point to. I read a speech he made the other day about our education policy, and at the end of it I thought, well, it sounds great, but how's it going to work? How much is it going to cost? You've got to have these answers. Anyway, but every time I say anything like that, there's just this avalanche. Tories, red Tory, Blairite scum. I'm regularly being accused of, there's these Blairite plots the whole time to get rid of him. I think if there's a Blairite plot, I would know about it. Right? I don't know of the plot. If anything, I think we've possibly been too quiet. I think that the Labour Party needs to understand that we lost the last election and stop behaving like we won it. We lost. And, this Jeremy Corbyn thing, I mean, it's fine, great, you can get your name sung, but you need people who are not saying your name to vote for you. So, and anyway, the point about what Fiona tells me is that when it comes to actually the hard grind and knocking on doors and putting leaflets through doors, it tends to be the old members are doing it. Whereas the £3 Facebook people, a lot of them I think may have already moved on to something else. Now I think it's great if you've got more members, fantastic, but they've got to be mobilised and used for something that isn't just about protecting somebody's position within the Labour Party. It's got to be about reaching out to these people who don't like Jeremy Corbyn, who don't like John McDonnell, because they're the ones who are going to have to vote. And there's a real danger at the next election, and again, you know, I guarantee this will, if somebody tweets this out, there'll be a bit of Blairite scam by the time I get on the train. At the last election, just got to be honest about this, a lot of people voted Labour thinking they could clip the Tories' wings, but there was no danger of Jeremy Corbyn being Prime Minister. Now, the next election, there's every possibility Jeremy Corbyn could be Prime Minister. That's going to change the dynamic. And bear in mind as well, there'll be a different Tory leader. Now, it might be somebody just as bad as Theresa May. The chances are, looking at who's in for it now, it would be. But it might not be. It might not be. And the Tories will have this wretched media that will get around. I mean, the funniest thing in the last election was the Daily Mail, day after day, they took to calling her Theresa. Do you know that? Trying to project Theresa May as this sort of amazing human being with these lovely empathetic touches. And, you know, I mean, just embarrassing. But that's quite a thing to have if they change Labour just before the election. So Labour's got a lot of work to do, and they need to. And I don't have the feeling that they're doing it.
Lady in the glasses up the middle with the big earrings.
Thank you.
Are Labour going to win next time?
Well, I don't know. Look, if you'd have said to me before the last election, did I think Theresa May was going to lose a majority? I didn't. I didn't think she was going to lose a majority, and she did. Did I think Brexit was going to happen? I thought it 2 weeks out is when I thought it. Because I was up in Burnley, and there were too many people there were all the people who I expected to be telling me to vote and leave, but there were lots of people I didn't expect telling me, and I thought, this is moving away. But a month before I didn't think it was going to happen. I didn't think Trump was going to win. So we're in anything goes territory. And so Labour definitely can win, no doubt about that. But to win, they've got to get the people over who didn't vote last time, and they've got to analyse what is stopping them. And let's be honest, Theresa May is without doubt the most useless Prime Minister I've ever seen. And she's level pegging. She's actually ahead in some polls as to who you prefer as Prime Minister.
Sorry.
You speak a lot about how being different and creativity and passion, and if you harness that in the right way, can fuel change. But as a 20-year-old millennial, all I can really see is if that you don't have a PPE from Oxbridge, you can't actually make a change. And that, I think, is also evident in the tax avoidance coming out, that the people who make the laws don't want to change the laws on tax because it would impact them. So how would you respond to that?
Well, there's two parts to that. The one is, can, as it were, anybody make change? I think people can make change. I think people can make more change than they think they can. Now, big sort of getting the law changed, that's a whole different thing. But I mentioned examples earlier that started from campaigns. The Time to Change campaign on mental health, we've definitely made change. But you can't always sort of measure it and feel it. It's not always about money or buildings or whatever. But a lot of it's about how you change attitudes. So I think you can make change. The thing about something like the Paradise Papers and tax avoidance and what have you. I mean, look, Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor and when he was Prime Minister, he was obsessed with trying to close down a lot of tax loopholes. And I think one of the things that, and had some success, but one of the things we didn't do well enough, in my view, is that we were so keen to be projecting ourselves as kind of economically credible, which we were. For one of the worst things that the Labour Party has done to itself is that we allowed the Tories to define our entire record as, the mess we inherited from Labour, when actually it was a crash caused by global stuff, mainly greed in America, And I'm afraid Ed Miliband just did not push back when Cameron did that mess we know. So, but I think we were maybe so focused on, you know, this idea of wanting to be seen as economically credible. So the whole globalisation thing felt good for us, but we didn't talk enough, didn't warn enough, didn't act enough on the, if you like, the downsides of globalisation. The fact that there are some things that individual governments just cannot do effectively on their own. This tax avoidance thing, we're going to see this with Brexit, we're going to see relocation all over the place. It's so, how do you? I think every government in the world is looking at the moment, looking at Amazon, looking at Google and thinking, how are we going to get effective, you know, how are we going to address inequality if we can't, if the biggest earners in the world, we just can't get them to pay tax, and they're global entities. So that is a change that I think goes beyond just the fact that MPs aren't very good at what they do. If that is how I'm slightly reading your view, and there's all these sort of Oxford. I've got to say my son got a PPE from Oxford, so don't hate them all. He's now a poker player and a football analyst. So hope he's paid tax.
We've got time just for a couple more questions. So if you really want to, actually, I promised the chap in the middle there, one, and the lady over there.
And everybody else can grab me after, as long as I get home tonight.
So if we give it to the lady first and then pass it to the chap in the middle.
Do you believe in your heart that Brexit could be stopped, or is our best hope to wait until the next generation sees what a huge cock-up it's been and make a change at that point?
Well, I said earlier, I'm hopeful without being optimistic. I am full of hope that, because you see, if it is left to the next generation, there's a danger it's too late. There's a danger the Europeans just think, you know what, it's not worth having them. They're never going to buy into this. Also, if we come out and have to go back in, will the Europeans enforce the got to join the euro? No, I don't know. They might not, but that's a possibility. So that's what I was saying to one of the Brexiteering students earlier, that, you know, there's a possibility that the one thing you really, really hate, the euro, actually you might end up with it because of what you've done. And the rebate, losing the rebate. So but I do think, I think this is why I do really genuinely think that it can be stopped, because I genuinely think that's what the country now wants. And the reason you don't hear it as much is because you've got both the government and the opposition effectively saying there's no alternative. Well, there is an alternative. The alternative is that Article 50 gets revoked and the thing gets put on hold. And when I say that, as I said it on television yesterday, you're talking the country down, you want to do a bad deal, blah, blah, blah. I think it'd be great if they get a good deal, but they're not going to. They're either going to get no deal or a bad deal. There's no deal better than what we've got. It's impossible. How can there be a better deal than being part of, with access to, the biggest trading market in the world? What is the better deal that you get? The whole thing, it's the biggest madness of our life. And I think more and more people think that. So you've just got to stay angry. You've got to stay angry, you've got to go and, you know, kick your door in of your MP and say, what on earth are you doing? You've got John Redwood. Yeah, well, go and get his door in and say, excuse me, when you said, what did you mean, Mr. Redwood, when you said that? But seriously, they've got to know, they've got to feel heat. And the other ones who've got to feel heat are the Labour ones, who say that they're, you know, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn goes on about listening to the members. What do Labour Party members want? They don't want Brexit. And, you know, I thought, we've got the budget on Wednesday. I mean, have you ever seen a bigger shambles than this? So they're going to be saying, we'll do this for health, and this for housing, and this for this, and this for this. If this hard Brexit goes ahead, our economy is going to shrink. I read a thing the other day, it blew my mind. If every lorry coming through Dover was stopped for 2 minutes, right? Now I've been to borders in the Balkans. I've seen borders, right? 2 minutes is nothing, right? If every lorry going through Dover was suddenly subject to a 2-minute stop, you have an instant 17-mile traffic jam. Where are they going to go? They haven't thought of any of this stuff. And apparently that idiot Johnson, whose nuts you lot are going to need, if you say any of this to him in the Foreign Office, because the Foreign Office are at the wit's end with that guy, right? There's most of them, a lot of serious people, they're trying to actually brief him on stuff like, don't say that the woman teaches German, because that might get a jail sentence extended, and it's not true, right? When they say this stuff about, a few facts, he puts his fingers in his ear and sings the national anthem. We've been led by a bunch of liars, fantasists and delusionists, and a poor woman who's a prisoner of them.
So I said there was one question there. No pressure. If we could get the microphone across.
Last question.
It's going that way, one row behind you.
So you're obviously a very keen supporter of the European Union. Do you think that...
I'm a keen supporter of Britain.
Britain in Europe.
Britain.
Do you think that New Labour should have done more to put a more positive narrative around European Union? And do you think you would have won a referendum in that referendum back?
I don't know. I don't know about the second part, but about the first part, yeah. And it's really funny, when I was in number 10 with Tony, he was way more pro-European than me. I was always a bit sceptical. Sceptic about the euro. I hated European summits. Balls aching. Why did they have to do everything through the night? I mean, it's just ridiculous. But since it sort of hit me that we're going to lose this, I've become absolutely, I don't think I've ever felt as strongly about this as anything. So, but you're right, we framed it far too much as, we go there and win, and Tony's the most pro-European Prime Minister we've ever had, I think. But even he was, we're calibrating it all the time. So I think particularly in that first term we should have gone for it much more.
And do you think that you ignored the downsides of globalisation while you were in office as well for too long?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. We didn't alert people to the realities of downsides. And you see it now, it's like you can't, when Trump goes to those former coal communities and says I'm going to bring the mines back, he's lying. When McDonald promises that all these jobs are going to be brought back here and there, the economy's changed. Now you can change it. You can change it to something different, but you can't change it back. So yeah, I think I wish we had been, and I do think that one of the reasons why Cameron lost the referendum, and isn't it amazing? I mean, God, he just vanished. But one of the reasons why he lost the referendum is because you can't turn around 40 years of, this Europe, something that's being done to us, in a few weeks. Scepticism was deeply ingrained in his party, and he played to that all the time. And the other mistake he made was sort of saying that, setting so much store on this renegotiation. Europe is complicated. It's about... it is about the detail, it is about treaties, it is about bits of law that, you do need lawyers and experts to understand. But what I don't think he did, and what we didn't do sufficiently, was to project Europe as a positive in its own right. Whereas Macron, bang out there he was. Yeah.
I'm feeling like a poor man's Dimbleby. I'm going to have to bring this to a close now. I apologise to the people I didn't get to for questions. One thing I would say before we close, and I hand back to Sir David, is our counselling team here have put together an absolutely fantastic pack around all of the mental health support that there is here at the university. Please do take one when you go, whether it's for yourself, whether it's for a friend or a colleague. They are really, really well worth having.
And let me know if it's crap.
Let me hand back to Sir David to close.
Thank you very much, Mark. Perhaps appropriately for a Campbell, it says in the tin, Campbell talks Campbell on mental health and politics. We certainly got that tonight. Alastair Campbell.